Operative. Chapter 1. Who's the spook? Brill sat at the back of a small room, with 7 sailors seated in front of him. An 8th man, their lieutenant, stood beside a projection screen at the head of the room. None of the men turned around to look at him, though they all shot appraising looks as they entered in quiet order and took their seats. "He's not a spook," said the lieutenant as he nodded at Brill. "He's on loan to us from Homeland." "Isn't Homeland a spook business?" shot back one of the men. He was the tallest in the group, with a buzzed haircut and piercing blue eyes. "You want to explain?" the lieutenant asked Brill. He shook his head no. His instructions were to say nothing and observe, and he planned to follow them to the letter. This was his first assignment after 9 months on the farm, a CIA training facility in the Virginia countryside. He had been flown down this morning in an F-16 to Naval Station Key West to task with the SEAL team that operated from there. "Loose lips sink ships, am I right?" one of the sailors turned to grin at him. He had dusky black skin and etched muscles. He held out a corded forearm. "Washington," he kept grinning. "Like the president." Brill considered the hand for a moment and leaned up to shake it. "Pleasure," he disobeyed his orders. It was the first handshake he had taken in over a year. 9 months ago, he was picked up in South Africa and brought back to the United States. The man who met him when he was let off the plane in plastic zip ties and a hood was U.S. Senator Shelby Johnson, an old acquaintance from his home state. Shelby didn't shake hands. Instead, he ushered Brill to a private office for a meeting with the president, who conscripted Brill back into service for his country after absconding to South Africa. Technically, he wasn't attached to Homeland Security or any government agency. He worked for a private company called Barack, owned by Johnson, that contracted with the government. Brill wasn't supposed to know Shelby owned it, but the company, Barack, was named after a street in the hometown they shared. "Let's zero in on the mission," the lieutenant called out. "Our guest can share over chow." The sailors settled in and focused on their leader. "Our target window is pretty tight," he started, and pulled up a map of Africa on the overhead projector. "We're tasked with a smash and grab. CIA has intel that Abu Aish is in Nigeria working with Boko Haram." He clicked a button, and the projector advanced to a topography map of Nigeria. Abu Aish is under the protection of a platoon strength or more of Nigerian terrorists. They traced him to a town 120 clicks south of the border with Algeria, called Sakuto. "We're doing a beach insert in the port of Lagos and catching a ride north on a Red Cross plane. We will exfil in manner same." He glanced at his men. "This is not an easy mission. Nigeria is Africa's most populous nation. It's got huge oil field reserves, and the leader of this group, Mohammed Youssef, is no joke." "What does the name mean?" "You want to speak to this," the lieutenant said to Brill. "Boko Haram means roughly Western fraud. These animals are strict followers of the Quran and preach violent overthrow of the Western-influenced government." "How are they armed?" asked the tall blue-eyed man. Brill nicknamed him Sinatra in his head. "They get arms from the old Soviet bloc, but don't be surprised if you see U.S. munitions and equipment. We arm a lot of the governments that keep getting overthrown by rebels, who take the weapons and sell them. We're looking at AKs and Vietnam-era M16s mostly. The terrorists don't have access to planes or any air support, but they are masters at making do with RPGs and tank busters." "You're our African expert?" asked Washington. Brill shrugged. "I've spent a little time in country," he said, referring to the years he was with South African reccees and then contracting under a mercenary group. "My purview is Angola, Sierra Leone, and other points, but the rebel groups operate pretty much the same way." "Even Islamic terrorists?" Again he shrugged. "Africa has over 2,000 religions, so Islam, Christian, animist, Lion King, it doesn't really matter. These Boko Haram soldiers are going to be hopped up on stava or other drugs, so religion won't have as much sway as you think. What you will remember is a bullet from their gun will kill you no matter what you or they believe. Preach, Washington grinned. All right, let's get on with the particulars, said the lieutenant, as he pulled their attention back to the front of the room to lay out mission parameters. Chapter 2. Brill sat in the back of a C-130, crammed into a narrow jump seat, and tried to sleep. It was something the instructors drilled into him. First training with the South African Defense Forces, and reinforced on the farm, the CIA training facility in the rolling hills of Virginia. Sleep wouldn't come on this trip. Maybe he was too nervous. Though it wasn't his first foray into the field, and he was used to action in hot spots, maybe it was working for Barack for the first time and wanting to do well for Senator Shelby. They found him after his squad was killed in Angola, and he was working in South Africa for Mr. Van Housen, his old girlfriend's dad. Brill was caught up in a CIA sting, fronted by Barack Services, a private military contractor. They rendered him back to the U.S. when they discovered his identity, and Shelby scooped up the Special Forces recce soldier for additional training in covert ops and wet work. Brill knew what he was. A killer for hire. He studied the men in the cargo hold of the plane with him. Their features were harsh under the red glowing lamps in thin metal cages spread every few feet along the bulkhead wall. They were killers, soldiers like he had once been. They might have even called him a brother in arms, even though he worked and trained in an ally country as opposed to the beaches of San Diego and swamps of Florida. Now he was a freelance contractor. Technically, if they were caught, the sailors around him could be used as bargaining chips for terrorist groups or foreign governments in diplomatic conversations. If he was caught, nobody would know his name. So he didn't plan on getting caught. The sailors slept, despite the rumble and roar of the jet engines right outside of the thin metal shell. The plan was simple. They would land in the Azores and load into the back of a Chinook. It would ferry them offshore and drop them into the Atlantic. The squad would inflate IRB, inflatable rigid boats, to carry them through the busy shipping lanes where they would make the edge of the port, scuttle the boats, and swim to a pre-designated pier. After that, they would sneak through town to an airfield where a chartered plane under a Red Cross logo waited to carry them north. There were a lot of moving parts and multiple opportunities at Discovery. It would not be the way he planned an op, thought Brill, but since he was a guest on this foray, he kept his mouth shut. He preferred things to be more in control, but if the powers to be wanted to serve up some chaos, he'd chow down with gusto and ask for seconds. He also planned to learn as much as he could and apply it to future ops. His mentor, Simon, had drilled that into him as well. There were no failures, just opportunities to learn. The engine roar shifted as they began their descent, and the sailors around him stirred, instantly alert. He had to hand it to SEALs. They were some trained hard chargers. Hell, half of them might make good recce's, he grinned in the dim hold of the plane. Chapter 3. The plan went off without a hitch, until Washington slithered up the metal-rung ladder, bolted to the side of a pylon, and onto the black pier. The god of luck put a guard on the far side of the boards, hidden among a stack of boxes as he snuck a cigarette. The startled yelp made Washington fumble for the Glock 19 strapped to his leg. Brill was second on the ladder and saw the long SEAL making the draw. He yanked his cig from the holster and drilled a silenced shot into the guard. A shadow detached from the land and quietly pounded down the rough-hewn boards toward their position. Brill turned and sent 2 shots into the man, and watched as the body pitched over onto the boards, leaking. He studied the surroundings as the rest of the SEAL team slithered up and took positions. Washington moved in a running crouch toward the fallen body. "Damn it," he grunted. "That was our fixer." Brill snorted. "You told Fixer your infill position?" "He had to meet us to move across town," Washington whispered back. Brill shook his head. It was common wisdom for operators in Africa to only trust a fixer you'd worked with twice or more. They were notoriously loyal to money and could be bought off for several $100s or even a threat to their family if they had it. And you never told your fixer where you came in or out. The rule was to meet somewhere neutral and safe. This guy probably set the guard on the ladder so he could foil their entrance and split the reward. Good riddance as far as Brill was concerned. He couldn't share that with the team though. Confidence was 99% of the mission going in country with limited intelligence. Knowing they were betrayed from the get-go meant they might scrub the mission, and his orders were to get the job done no matter what. "We'll get across town," he told Washington. "Move your men off the pier and take a position behind that warehouse." He pointed to a dark structure that loomed near a rickety wooden fence. "I'll be back in 10 minutes." He stood up and marched off the dock like a guard. Washington made a quick grab for him but missed. The LT scooted up next to him. "Where the fuck is he going?" he said in a harsh whisper. "Told me to move our guys over to that warehouse and wait." The LT glanced down at the leaking body splayed on the concrete. "Is that our fixer?" Washington nodded. "Who the fuck is this guy?" the LT grunted almost too loud. He used finger motions to send the men forward, 2 by 2, to secure a spot next to the warehouse. He didn't know who Brill was, but he knew that once they got clear he would read him the riot act. This was his mission. "And I'll be damned if some spook wannabe is going to fuck it up," he muttered to himself, as he crouched in a run to hook up with his men in the shadow of the warehouse. Washington kicked the fixer's body over the side and listened to the splash before he followed. Chapter 4. A sandy beach insert would have been simpler, but access to the airport was taken into consideration. By using the port as an entry point, they cut out 45 minutes of ground time, which diminished the opportunity for discovery. 8 white men and 1 black man on a bus would not go unnoticed, even in the darkest hours of the night. Brill moved to the guard shack and peeked inside. A young man was sleeping with his legs propped up on the counter, mouth open in an impressive snore. He sneaked under the bar that blocked the road and went in search of transportation. The port of Lagos was one of the busiest in the region. Ships plowed through the waterways at all hours of the night, and a third shift worked on a pier 3 over from the dark one they ascended just a few moments before. Brill found a pickup truck next to one of the buildings. He planned to break the driver's side window, but tried the handle and it popped open. He slid inside and hot-wired the ignition just as he'd been taught in Virginia. The truck was not an ideal transport, but it would do. He would cram Washington in the cab with him, the black face prominent for anyone looking at them as they passed. He would instruct the others to lay in the back. They had a timetable to keep, and the airport wasn't so far that they couldn't use the cover of darkness to their advantage. Chapter 5. The pickup and the pickup transition went smoothly. Brill drove up next to the fence with his headlights off and eased to a stop with squealing brakes. The SEAL team cut the wire along the bottom of the fence and slid under. Washington climbed up front without being told, and the LT scowled at Brill and snarled. But he jumped in the truck bed and hunkered down with his men. Brill followed Washington's instructions to the airport. The CO read off directions taped to a plastic insert on his BDUs that led them to an unguarded back entrance. When Brill slowed to a stop, one of the men in back hopped out and forced open the gate with the same pair of bolt cutters he used back at the pier. Brill wheeled the truck to the side of a hangar, and they abandoned it to meet the small Otter twin engine with a Red Cross logo painted on each wing that waited for them. Chapter 6. When most people think of Africa, the first thing that comes to mind is jungle. Visions of Tarzan swinging vine to vine, lording it out over super-intelligent apes, who would one day rise up to take over the planet, was what most people considered when they thought about the Dark Continent. If they ever thought about it. Africa had vast resources and amazing people. Yet headline after headline in the Western world focused on the atrocities committed by a few maniacs. Africa spans several climate zones, from rugged rock-strewn coasts in the south to sprawling deserts in the north. Sokoto was on the edge of the desert. "Where are the monkeys?" Washington whispered. The SEAL team dug in on the edge of town and set up observation posts. They used shovels to scrape out depressions in the sand that threatened to fall in on top of them if they got too deep, and then lay under tan sand-covered tarps while the midday sun beat down on them. This far north, the only green things that grew were along the shallow, winding rivers. The desert marched south in a relentless progression that threatened to take over the entire continent one day. Brill had read that it advanced at the rate of 2 feet per year, and with global warming threats may move up to 4. No one alive today, or for the next 6 generations, would see it happen, but if the Sahara reached the equator, it was the end of mankind. It was hard to think in terms like that, especially faced with survival today. Brill had seen it when he returned to America, and in small villages flung across South Africa. The mentality was now, not the future, and forward thinking didn't go too far beyond setting up food, shelter, and survival for the next day. Maybe that was the human condition, he pondered as he sweated under a tarp next to Washington. The LT had started to berate him as soon as they disembarked from the plane, but Brill just stared at the man until he shut up. Washington had watched it happen, and wondered if maybe the spook was going to kill his LT, which would cause all sorts of problems for his team, not the least of which was they would have to kill Brill. Or try. One look at his eyes made him wonder if the man didn't already have a plan to kill them all. A Marine told him that once. Have a handshake, a smile, and a plan to kill everyone in the room. He grinned, but it was sick gallows humor. Brill was no Marine, of that he was sure. But he did have military training, following the sync of the unit. He was something more, though, and Washington shuddered for a moment. The memory of the man's dead shark eyes watching the LT as he tried to yell in a whisper. Washington dragged him away with an info request on how to deploy the unit for observation and heading off any potential disasters. LT assigned the spook man to his hole just to get even. "What do you see?" Brill asked from next to him. "I don't see a platoon of Nigerians," Washington whispered as he peered through the lens of a pair of binoculars. "Midday," said Brill. "I haven't gone up against Islamists before, but don't they pray?" "Mission brief says they do." Washington took a sip of water from his camelback pack. "I haven't seen many pray, though. Fornicate small boys and goats, lie, cheat, drink, kidnap girls into slavery, sure, but pray. Been here before. Not this sandbox, but one just like it. I wish there was a way to tell a good Muslim from an Islamist." Washington blew out his breath. "One of the guys in my old unit was a Muslim. Best guy the first knew. Fucking Islamist blew him up in Afghanistan. Guy was dressed like a goat herder, had a wife and 2 kids with him when he detonated the bomb. How do you fight that shit?" It was a question Brill couldn't answer, and the CO didn't expect one. When the enemy dressed like civilians and hid among civilians, it made traditional warfare outmoded. Which is where Brill and guys like him came in. He wasn't part of the military command structure and could operate outside the boundaries of the Geneva Convention. His only role was to capture or to kill, with very little deviation from that mission. Even here, as the SEALs were tasked to capture an Islamic fundamentalist for interrogation, Brill's job was to go a little bit further inland and eliminate a scientist. No questions, no intelligence, just a simple kill order. Something he was good at. Chapter 7. Dusk moved quickly in from the east. The sky shifted from pink to purple to black with a swiftness that took a little getting used to. There were no city lights to fight back the night sky, and the Milky Way stretched across the horizon in an explosion of 1,000,000 stars. Brill took a moment to appreciate it. Most of his time had been under a jungle canopy, with the stars blotted out by plant life or clouds or mist. The desert air was clear of all obstruction, except for dust particles that made the sunset a riot of colors to put a rainbow to shame, and now a sky full of stars that must have looked much the same 1,000 years ago when nomads wandered the sands. The LT called the squad together and outlined the plan. Their day of observation had yielded little more than a sleepy village with no sign of militia or military. They were going to go in at 3 a.m., that time of morning when the body is designed to hit REM. Abu Aish was reported to be in the university in the city. Even though the men had pictured brick walls and lush grounds, their experience was based on American and European universities. In Sokoto, it was 2 buildings, single-story structures behind a wrought iron decorative fence. The grounds were sand-covered dirt, with sand-covered paths that led from a central courtyard. One of the buildings was a dormitory, one was full of classrooms. There was a light on in the classroom building. An IR indicated 3 bodies in prone positions in the room. Sleeping men and their heat signatures. The plan was to move in quick, grab the 3, and extradite them to a secure location to await pickup from the Red Cross plane. Brill listened as the plan was laid out. He knew, just as these men did, that no plan survived contact with the enemy. The LT was well trained, though, and spent time going over contingencies with his men. "What's the spook's role?" asked one of them. The LT turned to ask Brill what he was going to do while they grabbed the terrorist, but he was gone. Chapter 8. Slipping away from the SEALs in the dark wasn't easy. If they pointed their IR goggles in his direction, they would see him jogging away at a steady 7-minute mile. He could keep up the pace for 2 hours or so, plenty of time for him to reach his intended target. He didn't know what it was about Islamists, but they liked to hide out in universities. Abu Aish used the students as cover, perhaps, or maybe he was looking for idealistic educated youth to convert to his cause. No matter the reason, while the SEAL team was taking him down at one location, Brill planned to be at a second university 15 miles north. "Your target is a Nigerian scientist," he was told. "The man is giving chemicals and biologicals to terrorists." They gave him the name, description, apartment number on campus, and routine. He memorized it all, so if he was caught, he wouldn't have intelligence on him. He didn't plan on getting caught. He settled into the run, the steady pace crunching into the sand as he knocked out the miles under the desert night. He wouldn't have made it in the daytime. He was used to heat training. 3 or 4 sauna sessions per week helped not only with recovery, but with some physiological benefits he couldn't explain. Something to do with increased blood plasma density, which helped with recovery and oxygen delivery during exertion. Maybe he'd asked the scientist about it before he killed him. He grimaced a wolfish grin as he ran. Brill had no illusions about who he was. He was a killer. Ever since he was kidnapped in Africa and lost the love of his young life, he felt like a dead man walking, a ghost. Ghosts had nothing to fear, not even death, and so he delivered it with great efficiency. He found his way into the South African Defense Force and became a recce until his platoon was ambushed. It was sheer luck that saved his life, though he was counted among the dead. He walked out of the jungle and into a band of vagabond surfers, living the dirtbag life out of their vans, chasing waves and drinking beer. He spent months with them, learning to surf and meditate, adding yoga to his fitness mix and expanding his running resume. He also did some investigation into his platoon and connections that wanted to keep something in the jungle secret. He was on the verge of discovering who orchestrated the ambush when he was rendered back to America to work for Barack and Senator Shelby Johnson, who wanted to develop his special skill set as a weapon to be deployed against enemies, foreign and domestic, both corporate and government. If his scientist was supplying terrorists with biologicals and chemical weapons, why weren't the SEALs tasked with stopping him? Brill wondered. The 15 miles disappeared under his feet, and he came to the edge of another small village. It was windswept and sand-blown, brown buildings baked to a dull sand-colored tone from years under the desert sun. Brill didn't need to dig in and observe. The scientist lived on the 3rd floor of an apartment building in the middle of a jam-packed residential street. There was no crowd now, but it seemed that all the residents lived in 3-story structures jammed side by side overlooking the narrow byway. As Brill moved along the street, he saw why. There was a well in the middle of a courtyard between 2 buildings, probably the only source of water for miles around. He walked up to the well and filled the bladder in his backpack, dropped in 2 iodine tablets to kill off most of the parasites. He would be going back under the morning sun, which would increase his sweat rate. Already he could tell he was getting low, so he sucked down the bladder full of water and refilled it again. Dehydration was one of those things most people didn't talk about, but marketers in America had everyone convinced it was epidemic. 99% of the people were never going to have a problem, but Brill learned that the jungle sucked the moisture right out of you. The desert was worse, even at night. The brain was surrounded by a sack of fluid, which shrank when the body was low on water. It could impact thinking and critical motor skills at the wrong moment. Better to keep hydrated when he had the chance. The scientist was on the 3rd floor of the middle building. It was a secure location, and it made getting to him difficult. Not impossible, but Brill liked to play the odds, which were never in his favor. In a street this crowded, the odds were against him that he would run into someone. In a crowded building, the apartment would have residents on either side, and even though advance intel told him the scientist lived alone, Brill knew that it was 50-50 he had someone in the studio with him. The odds were always 50-50. Either he would run across someone on his way up, or he wouldn't. Either the neighbors would be fighting insomnia and hear him work, or they wouldn't. Either scientist was by himself, or he was with someone. It was always a coin toss, and every coin toss, no matter how many times you flipped it, had an equal chance of coming up head or tails. Since he knew the odds, he marched over to the building with the same confidence he displayed on the pier. No one hardly ever bothered a confident man. They just assumed he knew what he was doing. The door to the stairwell was locked with a simple latch. He flicked open a 6-inch lock blade and shimmied the bar open. The door hinges squeaked as he slid it in. Brill pulled the silenced pistol he carried from the pouch at his back and took to the stairs. He used the edge of the wood to minimize creaking, but the age, the dry wood, and rusty nails conspired against him. He didn't want to sound like a man sneaking up the stairs, so instead, he trudged in his best imitation of someone coming home after a long, hard day. Not too noisy, but not overtly trying to hide the noise either. He hit the 50% chance of no one in the stairwell and no one on the 3rd floor landing. So far, so good. The apartment was the door in the middle. He could knock, but that would attract too much attention. Brill studied the doorknob. It was a simple brass knob with a skeleton key lock. He gripped the knob in one hand and lifted gently, sliding the lock blade between the frame and door, then sawing down softly. He felt the blade catch on the latch and maneuvered it in slowly, shoving it into the door. If the scientist used a deadbolt or chain, he would have to think of something else. But the simple door lock was all he used. He passed part of the neighbor odds and said a silent wish to the universe that the man was alone. He was. He slept on a small twin mattress in the corner, an oscillating fan blowing warm air over his naked body. He was thin and soft-looking with a scraggly beard and graying hair. The man didn't look like much of a threat, except between the ears where it mattered. He was a chemist par excellence, with dual doctorates in chemistry and biology. A potent combination. If the guy wasn't an Islamic terrorist, he could have put his big brain to work solving everyday problems that faced his people. The hunger and fear of food shortages could be solved with the creation of drought-resistant crops. The safety everyone desired for their family and loved ones could be introduced through better living conditions. Brill knew that most advances in civilization came at the behest of a corporate entity working on increasing profit, so the common good wasn't always at the forefront of every development. Still, Arab history was peppered with genius, lost to fanaticism and fear across the ages, as 1,000 years of misguided shamans and imams led a righteous people backwards in time. They weren't progressing, except in areas of how to kill Western influences and subjugate the masses. Brill raised the pistol and settled it just above the bridge of his nose. In World War II, America and Russia stole German scientists working on the atom bomb and secreted them away to warrens and dens in hinterlands of the country to continue their work. In the War on Terror, scientists were shot on sight. Any potential good they could do for their world far outweighed by the horror they could inflict. He pulled the trigger and spread the man's potential across the flat pillowcase. Brill turned and faced the door to wait out the odds on the neighbors. No one came. He gathered up some paper material spread out on the desk and stuffed it in his pack. Analysts back at Barak could look over it to determine if it was viable intelligence. He stopped with one piece of paper. It was an invoice from Barak, payment to the man dead in the bed. Brill tilted his head in confusion. Why had Shelby sent him after a scientist on the Barak payroll? Had the man gone rogue? What was he doing out here? A motor engine cut through the quiet of the village and set his hair on end. It was out of place and ripped apart the silence. No time to wonder. He shoved all the paper in his pack and took the stairs down 3 at a time. Chapter 9. Luck. It's one of those things that everyone says is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. Brill thought maybe the Scottish had a better angle on it. Luck was something mystical, and energy in the universe that gave some folks an edge over others. The converse could be true as well. Brill was lucky. At the bottom of the stairs, he slipped in the sand and spilled across the floor in a sliding heap. As he fell, bullets peppered the doorway and shattered the wooden stairs where he had been just a microsecond before. He covered his head and rolled behind the wall. Bullets shattered the wood and sprayed him with splinters. He pulled an extra magazine from his pouch and got ready. Who was shooting? Why? Those questions rolled through his mind as he searched for a way to peek outside. He had no idea how many there were or where they were situated. They were using AK-47s. That much he could tell from the distinct sound it made when firing at him. AKs were ubiquitous on the continent, practically a prize for every boy that turned 13. No answers there. Still, he just killed a terrorist scientist, so he could assume they had some sort of alarm on his door. Even though he hadn't seen one. Footsteps pounded on the walk outside. He heard the chatter of their voices, Arabic with a heavy African dialect. They kicked in the front door, and 3 men stormed the stairs, never bothering to clear the small foyer. Brill lifted his pistol and sent 3 shots into the back of their heads. The bodies pitched forward and slid down the stairs, leaving smears of blood and brains in a path. One of the legs of the lowest man twitched in a dead man's dance. Screams erupted from outside, followed by more bullets. They avoided the bodies of their fallen comrades, so the shots went high. Brill cowered on the floor and wondered how fast he could roll across and grab a rifle. Would the men outside react in time? The door was hanging by one hinge, giving him a limited view outside. 6 men gathered around a pickup truck, a Nissan 4-wheel drive, which was one of the most common vehicles in Africa. There was a mount for a .50 calories in the bed, but it was empty. The men were arrayed in a random pattern from the tailgate to the hood of the truck, each of their rifles trained on the door and spitting bullets into the dark opening. Lights were coming on in some of the apartments, though smart residents were staying dark until the shooting stopped. Smart, thought Brill. He took careful aim through the crack in the door, moving his pistol from the head of one man to the next in sight. He couldn't get all 6, not from this angle, but 2 were sure to fall. Brill popped them both. 1 minute they were standing, the next it was like someone cutting the strings on a puppet, and they dropped. The others noticed and stopped shooting, screaming obscenities instead. Brill rolled across the floor, yanked a rifle, and rolled back. A line of bullets stitched the ground next to the dead body. He checked the magazine, half full. He had never been a fan of spray and pray, but with 4 men left, and maybe more on the way, he needed to escape. He stuck the barrel around the corner, and squeezed off 3 round bursts in 3 blasts with one hand. He leaned around the corner, and shot the other 4 men as they scrambled for cover. The last one squirmed in the dirt, crying and squealing, his ripped abdomen spilling into the sand. Brill checked the street in both directions. No one there yet. He grabbed a second rifle from one of the dead bodies on the stairs and ran outside. 2 of the men were still breathing, the gut-shot crier, and another who was gasping with a sucking chest wound. Brill put him out of misery with a rifle shot to the head, then flipped over the gut-shot man. "Speak English," he growled in Afrikaans. The man mewled. He was worthless, concerned only with his own agony now. Brill ended his suffering. He grabbed 2 more rifles and magazines off the dead bodies and left them where they fell. It was going to be a story for authorities to piece together, but so far no witnesses had popped out to the street. He was sure they were watching him though, so as he jumped into the cab of the pickup truck, he grabbed a scarf and wrapped it around his head. Let anyone watching tell a story about Boko Haram shooting a scientist and then fighting it out among themselves. He cranked the truck. It wouldn't start. He pumped the gas and tried again, and this time it turned over. Brill dropped it in reverse and backed out of the village as fast as he could manage. When he reached the end of the street, he swung around in a giant cloud of dust and raced the 15 miles back toward the SEAL team. He wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew there was no alarm. That team had been on him too fast, and they were too ready to kill him. Someone had talked, and when he found them, they were never going to speak again. Chapter 10. Washington knew they were screwed. The cluster they had walked into turned sideways the moment they stepped onto campus. 3 a.m. was when most people were supposed to sleep, and SEALs were damn good at sneaking. So were young couples in love. Sinatra was focused on the building, and tripped over the young couple sleeping on a blanket wrapped in each other's arms. Their cries of alarm woke up the dorm rooms, but instead of disgorging students, armed militants streamed out. They had a choice: firefight with superior numbers, or retreat with the mission incomplete. The LT called retreat, and the team moved back under the cover of darkness. But Abu Aish was no fool. He had a backup squad with instructions to seal off the university, and the SEALs ran right into a bottleneck trap. Aish piled on the men surrounding them, until the team was in an untenable position. Outgunned, outmanned, and on lower ground. "Hold your fire," LT commanded. Washington had seen this scene in a movie once. A SEAL team sneaked through the sewers and came up in a prison basement, but set off tremor sensors that alerted the bad guys they were coming. When the last SEAL popped up into the basement, they were faced against a superior force with overwhelming firepower shooting down from high ground. A classic no-win, get-killed situation. "Surrender," Aish called out to them. His voice was light and effeminate, a harsh contrast to the demented terrorist he was. "LT," Washington grunted. The team glanced around, weapons drawn, ready to face down and die if called for. There would be nothing gained for it, except the deaths of good men. They would be tortured, but when they missed extraction, the U.S. would send in para-rescuers or negotiate for their release. The LT weighed their options. He wasn't sure if the team could take out enough terrorists for their loss to hold meaning. The bullet slammed into his Kevlar and knocked him backwards. He could hear 6 more shots follow as he struggled to catch his breath, struggled to reach his weapon and return fire. A boot slammed on his hand and crushed the bones. He screamed and lunged at the terrorist standing on his fingers. The man slammed a rifle butt into his head, and the LT blacked out. Chapter 11. Radio silence is nerve-wrenching and painful. Brill wanted to reach out to the SEAL team to get a situation report, but didn't for 2 reasons. 1. Orders were to keep quiet to avoid detection from electronic monitoring. The presence of the terrorist kill team waiting for him outside of Fazzy's house told him the mission had been compromised, or at least parts of the mission. 2. His radio had been shot in the firefight. A piece of metal or plastic from the shattered casing was embedded under his skin and causing him great pain. He ignored it, but he couldn't ignore the blood leaking down his leg. He ripped off a sleeve and made an impromptu wrap. It didn't feel like the shrapnel nicked anything vital, just a nice long tear wound. He cinched it as tight as he could with one hand and vowed to ask Washington for some quick clot and gauze once he hooked up with the team. The Nissan bounced across the rutted dirt path, carved out of the sand that passed for a road in these parts. He was used to it. A ride on a jungle path was usually an adventure in not breaking down, which the trucks always inevitably did. He hoped it wasn't the same for this stolen pickup. It carried him back towards Sokoto, and he paused on the edge of town. He couldn't see past the buildings, but something was up in the middle. A cloud of dust swirled up into the air before being whisked away and dispersed on the whistling wind. His eyes narrowed. The activity was near the university building, if he recalled his maps correctly. That's where the SEALs were supposed to make their capture. He expected to find them on the other side of town, but needed to investigate first. If the dust was trouble, they might need his help. He pulled the truck beside a building and killed the engine. There was a scarf on the seat, and he wrapped it around his head and shoulders. He still looked out of place in black BDUs, but the checkerboard headdress and assault rifle might dissuade second looks. He jumped out of the truck and jogged through the streets toward the university. He kept to the edge of the buildings, staying in shadows where he could. The small village was quiet, except as he drew closer to the dust cloud. Ahead, he could hear the murmur of a crowd. He sneaked to the edge of a building and peeked around. A group of AK-47-toting terrorists surrounded 6 of the SEALs. The Islamists had their faces hidden behind black scarves, waving their weapons, slamming them into the men. Each time one of the sailors pitched face first on the ground, the other terrorists would jump in and pound him with kicks, rifle butts, yelling and spitting. There were 15 of them. Brill could make out Washington, being the only black face in fatigues, and maybe the tall one was Sinatra. They were missing one man. Brill couldn't see the LT. That meant 2 things. Either he was dead or being interrogated. He checked the clip in his rifle and pulled a spare out of the pouch and prepared it for quick insertion. The reason the AK-47 is so ubiquitous in third world countries was because it was so simple to use and practically indestructible. But they still jammed. Brill didn't have time to disassemble and clean the weapon, so he checked the action and sent up a silent prayer to the gods of war that the previous owner had at least kept it out of the mud. One of the Islamists raised his gun and shot a SEAL in the thigh. The man screamed in pain, then rage. The terrorists laughed and shot the man next to him in the other leg. Brill raised the rifle and flicked the selector to semi-auto. He'd rather be using his pistol up close, but from this range it was hard to miss. He didn't. The terrorist shifted his rifle toward the next SEAL and dropped to the ground. A second glanced over at him and made a questioning noise. A hole opened up in his forehead, and he pitched over backwards. The crowd noticed something was wrong, and the murmurs took on a new pitch, higher, more fervent. Brill moved the sights along the group and aimed for headshots. He couldn't risk center mass because they might fire into the SEALs and ruin his rescue operation. He dropped 3 more before they began returning fire. Bullets jackhammered into the wall above his head. He dropped to one knee, sighted around the corner, and sent 2 more to their death. The SEALs went horizontal to give him a clean field of fire. Damn, their training was good, he thought. Too bad he couldn't say the same for the crowd. They scattered like sheep, screaming and shouting as they tried to escape, but hysteria made them move in concert, shoving and pushing the weaker out of the way. They also blocked the field so Brill couldn't just lay down a line of fire. He needed to make something happen, and fast. One of the Islamists would start grabbing hostages, either villagers or a SEAL, and he didn't want that to happen. It did. 2 of them grabbed Washington and cowered behind him as they stumbled toward a building on the far side of the university courtyard. Brill couldn't get a clear shot, not without exposing himself around the corner, and the remaining 8 were emptying their rifles into the wall he hid behind. Until they ran dry. Rule number 1 of a firefight. Always have more bullets than your enemy. Brill listened as the fire rate trickled to dry clicks. An AK can empty a clip at full auto in 4 seconds. Brill still had 16 bullets plus the magazine in his pocket. There were only 8 terrorists in the courtyard, plus the 2 almost behind Washington. He leaned around the corner and sent a bullet into the 8 as fast as he could pull the trigger. Washington dragged his feet, making it hard for the men to haul him backwards. They dropped him and ran for the corner. Brill put a bullet in each of their backs. He rounded the corner and pushed past the last of the fleeing crowd. The 2 wannabe kidnappers were scrabbling in the dirt for their weapons. He took careful aim at the back of their heads, and then they didn't move at all. Brill slung the rifle and gave Washington a hand up. He pulled the lock blade out and cut the twine binding his wrists. "We've got to move." Chapter 12. "Where's your LT?" he asked. Washington turned Sinatra over and checked him for wounds. The terrorists had shot into his Kevlar and left him with broken ribs and wheezing. He listened to his breathing, but the lung didn't make a sucking sound which indicated a punctured lung. Still, it was going to hurt to move him, and there was still the chance one of the ribs could penetrate the delicate tissue. "They took him," Washington said to Brill. Aish and 3 others took a truck in that direction. He pointed to the west. "How long?" "An hour. Maybe 2. It was tough to keep time. All of the men were battered and beaten. If they were captured during the raid, that meant they were tortured for 4 hours. They were still good for a fight, but not for a rescue mission." "Who takes command?" Brill asked. "I will follow orders," Washington huffed under the weight of Sinatra. "In the absence of orders, I will assume leadership until such a time as the mission is complete, or I am relieved of command by a superior officer." Goddamn, he loved SEALs. They were just like reccees. "Get these men to the airfield." "I left a truck 4 blocks over there by the edge of the city," Brill ordered. "I'm going to get the lieutenant." "How long should we wait?" "Until I get there." "I mean, what if you don't come back, man?" "I'm coming back. Don't leave without us." Washington gave him the once-over. "At least let me come with you." "Your squad is down by half," said Brill as he checked the load in his magazine. "You have wounded to tend, and a hostile force around our position. You're one man going into the shit by yourself." "I am the shit," Brill gave him a half-smile. "Yeah," Washington grinned back. "You're full of it, at least." He held out a hand. After a moment, Brill gripped it and shook. "Give me an hour, 90 minutes. I'll bring your lieutenant back. We'll be waiting." Chapter 13. "They went that away" is a pretty fair description when there's a posse chasing after the bad guys, But general directions weren't so great when one man was searching for another in the desert. Still, Brill kept his head as he ran in the direction Washington had indicated. The hard-packed roads were windswept almost nightly by the constant wind out of the desert, not only spreading sand across the clay, but also erasing all tire marks or hoof prints from the previous day's transportation. The road was bare. No tracks, no traces of movement in the sand drifts, just the ever-present encroachment of this attempt at civilization on the edge of wild spaces. Brill circled back toward the village and watched the buildings. The structures on this side of town were mostly houses, small adobe constructions that looked like they could have been lifted from the Middle Ages and baked under the burning sun. Aish and his men may have carried the LT into one of them for a more thorough interrogation, or to hold for ransom in exchange for releasing terrorist prisoners. But Brill doubted it. Not the reason for the kidnapping and separation. No, they would try to use the LT as a bargaining chip, just as they probably planned to televise the beheadings of half the SEAL team. He doubted they would take their prisoner into a home. A building on the corner of one street looked like a warehouse. Playing the odds again, it was 50-50 the LT was sequestered there. But the building felt right. It was away from the homes by the space of a house or two, set off by itself. People would hear the screams from torture, but it could be easy enough to ignore, softened by the wind. Brill skulked toward it in the shadows of other buildings. He didn't have much time. Someone might have reported the rescue of the team to Aish, or he may have heard the bullets. If he was a vengeful man, the LT might not have much time. And Brill knew most Islamists were very vengeful, even if they were miseducated, misinformed, and generally bad people. And he hated bad men. He reached the side of the building and leaned against the wall to catch his breath. He could hear them inside. Men shouting, yelling in Arabic. The sounds of fists hitting a body hard. He felt a tightening in his stomach. Torture brought it out in him. He could feel memories of the time he was kidnapped and tortured by Angolan rebels well up at the back of his mind, and fought them down. He did a quick set of box breaths, 3 count in, hold for 3, 3 count out, hold for 3. He only needed to do it twice, and the training kicked back in. The Zen state constant meditation had produced gave him a sense of clarity. There was a man behind that wall who needed his help. There were an unknown number of enemy, as few as 4 or as high as a platoon surrounding that man. Brill had a job to do. Kill them all and save the man. He checked the load in his clip, slipped the final full magazine from his pouch to have it close at hand in the pocket, and unstrapped his pistol. Chapter 14. There was a saying he had been taught by Simon during his short time with executive options in South Africa. The mercenary mentor drilled into his young protege the words that repeated through his mind like a mantra. Move fast. Strike first. Strike hard. He knew it worked because he had used the philosophy so effectively in the past. Maybe it was a maxim from the past. A gunfighter who keeps his head in a gunfight when the world around him is going to hell is the one who walks away. He moved toward the door. It made sense. Most people aren't exposed to bullets and loud explosions. That's why recce training and other SOGs around the globe used it so extensively. Fire at people repeatedly until it becomes second nature, and they learn to control the response mechanism that dumped adrenaline in the system. Breathing helped. It's always good to breath. He twisted the doorknob slowly. It was unlocked. Brill lifted the rifle to his shoulder, raised a boot, and eased the door open with his toe. "Hey!" someone screamed in Arabic. Brill marched in and began shooting. He dropped 2 of the men before the other 2 recovered and began returning fire. Their first shots went wild, stitching a pattern on the wall behind him. Brill shot the one on the far left and swung right to hit the second. Too late. The man smiled as he pulled the trigger, and Brill saw the flash of muzzle fire arc out and a bullet slammed into his shoulder. He fell back against the wall, as the terrorist zeroed in on his head. The LT kicked Aish in the knee, and bent it backwards with a loud snap. Aish screamed in pain, and struggled to turn his rifle on the seal. Brill yanked out his pistol, and shot him. "We were supposed to take him alive," the LT gasped, as he crawled across the floor on his hands and knees. "You're welcome," said Brill. The LT cradled his right hand against his waist, but worked with his left. He dug a quick clot package out of a leg pouch, and sprinkled the powder on Brill's leaking shoulder. "Through and through," Brill grimaced. LT nodded, and slapped a bandage on the front and back. He'd still need a medic, but at least he wouldn't bleed out. Brill examined the LT. His hand was mangled, his face a mishmash of bruises and open cuts, but he was breathing. "Did they shoot you?" "Any wounds?" he grunted. "Beat the shit out of me," LT grunted back. "Looks like we'll both live." "How are my men?" "Alive when I left. They pulled back to the airstrip to hold our LZ." "Then let's get moving." The LT tried to get up. It didn't work as well as he hoped. Blood loss and being beat left him dizzy. Brill helped him up, but mostly because he needed the assistance too. The two grabbed weapons off the fallen terrorists. "Search his pockets," LT ordered. "Take what we can." Brill frisked the dead bodies and recovered a few scraps of paper. They didn't look like much, but there were 2 cell phones in his pockets that he grabbed as well. Maybe they could pull intel from them. "Ready." Brill glanced at the LT. "What's the plan?" "Running out of the question." "I can shuffle," LT offered. "Then we grab a car." "I don't see a rental company out here," the SEAL smirked. "Find a way or make one Hannibal," Brill shot back. He checked the exit, searching the perimeter, and the 2 wounded men shuffled down the street shoulder to shoulder. Chapter 15. There wasn't a stolen pickup truck resting in the shade next to this building, but there was a rusty Peugeot that looked like it was held together with baling wire and prayers. Brill set the LT against the hood and growled as he leaned under the dash to hotwire it. Hot white pain lanced through his shoulder. He used the lock blade on his knife to pop open the steering column and strip the wires, then crossed the starter with the ignition and yelped. Sparks arced out on his fingertips, and the engine rumbled to life with the muffler popping. He pulled himself into the driver's seat, while LT hobbled over to the passenger door and fell in beside him. "Buckle up," said Brill, and slipped it into gear. The ancient crate took a moment to decide if it was going to roll, but eventually it did. Brill jammed the accelerator to the floor to get it up to 20 miles per hour. "I don't know what we'll find at the airport," Brill yelled over the wind coming through the windows. "If they ambushed you, then they may know that's the only way in and out." "We weren't ambushed," shouted the LT. "Stupid Murphy and his damn law." Brill nodded. He had some experience with that particular rule. "We tripped over a pair of lovers in the garden, and they gave us away." Brill stiffened in his seat. "Weapons hot," he called out. The LT glanced ahead. Someone, terrorists they assumed, had parked 2 trucks across the road to form a roadblock. Brill was very familiar with this tactic. It was a common enough strategy down in the jungle. Rebels put up impromptu toll booths to rob and steal from anyone using the road. They could move with impunity and operated pretty much everywhere. These did not look like rebels. As they drew closer, the visual became clear. Checkerboard headscarves meant Boko Haram. "Can we bust through?" LT asked. "In this?" Brill chuckled. "I'm open for a plan." The LT watched through the windshield. "How accurate are you, Lefty?" "I can shoot," he sulked. "Take the wheel." Brill lifted up his stolen AK and set 2 magazines in his lap. He reached for the LT's weapon. The man slid it back and held tighter. "I said I can shoot." Brill nodded. The man set the rifle in his lap and grabbed the wheel. "Pedal to the metal," the LT ordered. No other way, Brill answered. He settled the rifle out of the open driver's window and employed a technique he hated. Spray and pray. He stitched a line of bullets across the two trucks blocking the road and the men cowering behind them. He emptied one magazine, changed it out, and emptied the next. The LT steered with his uninjured left hand and somehow managed to wrest his rifle out of the passenger window to add to their firepower. Brill marveled at the training, because it must have been excruciating to slip his broken, mangled fingers through the guard and pull the trigger. The terrorists returned fire. They could hear bullets ping off the engine block, and a cloud of steam and smoke poured out of the hood. Go right, Brill screamed. The LT yanked the wheel right. They sailed past the roadblock in a sliding screech of sand and bullets. Brill lifted his pistol and used its more accurate sights to winnow down the enemy by 3. Then they were through. The remaining terrorists fired into the back of the car. The LT yelped. This is going to come back to bite me in the ass. That's a bullet, said Brill. They call it a $1 million wound. I know what they call the damn thing, LT snapped. We're leaving a trail of dead bodies that's going to create a stink to high heaven. Would you rather they kill us? We were supposed to be in and out unnoticed. How are we gonna exfil now? Brill watched the road ahead as they raced down the dusty desert road. With a terrorist army on their ass, he was wondering the same thing. Chapter 16. The terrorists didn't catch up with them. Murph may play fast and loose with the rules, but he had no favorites. Maybe they did some damage to the trucks at the roadblock. Maybe they took out a key leader, and in the absence of orders, the remaining Islamists snuck away to blow themselves up another day. Brill couldn't be sure. All he knew was they reached the airstrip, and the rest of the team was there at the stolen truck. He puttered up next to it at a blistering 5 miles an hour. The engine gave a groan, a shudder, and what sounded sadly like a scream of hissing steam before it finally died. Good boy, Brill patted the wheel. LT fell out of the passenger door and splashed blood across the sand-covered tarmac. Washington ran over and slapped him on the ass with a bandage, then helped him hobble toward the plane. The Red Cross worker stood on the steps and watched the team limp closer. He smiled, his eyes hidden behind mirror aviator sunglasses. Looks like you got into a little fight, he called to them in an African-tinged accent. He pulled his hands from inside the door and pointed pistols at the wounded men. Brill drew and fired. A bullet ripped through the pilot's smile and pitched him down the steps. Boko Haram, he said to the questioning looks from the SEALs. Washington leaned the LT against one of the other wounded men and clambered up the steps. A second later, he stuck his head out of the door. The pilot's dead, he said. Can any of you guys fly? We hitch rides, said Washington. He was our only way out of here. Not our only way, said Brill. Are you a pilot? Not quite, Brill said. Get everyone on board. What the hell are you thinking? Brill pointed to a dust cloud rapidly bouncing toward the airstrip from the direction of the village. The terrorists found a leader. I'm thinking we have company. The unwounded SEALs lifted their comrades and shuffled them into the waiting belly of the CJ plane. Brill climbed the stairs and flipped the pilot over to search his pockets. What are you looking for? Screamed Lieutenant. Key, Brill shouted back. The fucking plane doesn't need keys. Brill shrugged and ran into the plane. Close the door, he said to Washington and tripped into the cockpit. I thought you said you could fly. I didn't say anything, Brill studied the controls. It was a jumble of dials and gauges on a console in front of a yoke. He pressed the 2 pedals on the floor and listened to the clink of something near the back. Find the start button, he said. We're going to die. The lieutenant slid into the co-pilot's seat. He reached forward and jammed a button. The left engine roared to life. Brill jammed another button, and the right engine followed it. "Look for brakes," said Brill. He thrust the throttle forward, and the plane groaned. The LT jammed a second set of buttons, and the plane lurched forward. Brill used the pedals to turn it around, and the plane slowly rumbled toward the runway. "Speed," said the lieutenant. Brill shoved the throttle forward again. "More speed," said the lieutenant. He pushed back in his seat, trying to will the plane off the ground. "Buckle up," Brill yelled. Bullets pinged off the fuselage. "Speed," screamed the lieutenant. Brill jammed the throttle all the way down and yanked back on the yoke. The asphalt raced beneath the window as the end of the runway loomed. The plane shuddered once, shuddered twice, and lifted off the ground. It soared over the barrier, blocking the end of the runway, and straight toward buildings. "Speed," the lieutenant shouted again. Brill yanked up on the yoke, pulling it all the way to his stomach. The plane nose lifted almost straight up as it fought for altitude. Brill remembered that too high too fast could cause a stall, so he pushed the yoke forward, trying to level off. The Twin Otter bucked and rolled, but he finally got it under a semblance of control. It wasn't quite level, but it was headed in the right direction. "See," Brill breathed out in a huge sigh. "Flying." The LT reached up and flipped on the autopilot. "At least until we run out of gas. Flying is easy. Landing is the hard part." Washington slid into the navigator's seat. "We'll land. I trust him, LT." "Better you than me," he said as he unbuckled. "I'm going to check on my men." He slid past them and through the narrow cockpit door. Washington leaned across the recently vacated seat. "How's the shoulder?" the CO asked. "Works," Brill grimaced. "I'm going to need a long run after this mission," he grunted. "You run?" Brill asked. "How far?" "My last race was a 100-miler, the CO grinned. "That far?" Brill said. "I run, but haven't done a race yet." "You should." "What's your longest distance?" "I just run for fun." Our personality types need an outlet. Some guys lift weights, which I do, but for some of us it's not enough. We run for an hour at a 6-minute pace, and you're knocking out 10 miles. Try running 50 miles at a 7-minute pace. Or 100 at 9. Then you really know what you're made of. True grit. Yeah, after 50, it's all willpower. The body starts to do weird things. It's my release. I'll have to try it. Let me know, I'll run with you. "Deal," said Brill. "If you land," the CO smirked. "When we land." "Hey, I'm from Missouri. Show me." The two men stared at the horizon, the ground blending into a dark shade of verdant green as they passed beyond the reach of the desert and puttered over the treetops. Brill relaxed a little. The jungle below could be full of RPG-toting rebels, all aiming for the tail section of the Twin Otter, but he felt at home. He couldn't go back, though. Back in the U.S., he had to find some answers. Someone set him up. That meant there was a leak in the organization, and he needed to find out who. He kept a hand on the yoke and planned it out in his head while his shoulder throbbed. His mission 1 was a success, but not without lessons. He wondered if the next one would have as big of a bang.